Black Mercedes sedans pulled up outside the small café in the old downtown district. Men in dark suits stepped out, their eyes scanning every corner as if searching for something. The first man opened his briefcase, pulling out a photograph. The familiar face of Walter, Maya's regular customer every morning. "We're looking for William Hayes," came the cold voice. "He might be hiding somewhere around here." Maya stood behind the counter, the pocket watch that Walter had forgotten yesterday still in her hand. On the watch's cover, small engraved letters read, "William Hayes, for service above self." Everything she thought she knew about Walter was about to change completely. We wonder where you're watching from tonight, because maybe you've met someone like her, someone who changed everything with one small act. The fluorescent lights of Morning Brew Cafe flickered to life at 5:45 a.m., casting their familiar yellow glow across the worn linoleum floor. Maya Chen moved with practiced efficiency through her opening routine, flipping chairs down from tables, starting the coffee machines, and arranging the day-old pastries behind glass that had seen better years. The downtown district around the cafe was slowly awakening, delivery trucks rumbling past, streetlights still glowing against the gray dawn sky, and the distant hum of early commuters beginning their daily migration. This neighborhood had character, the kind that came from decades of working families, immigrant-owned businesses, and people who knew each other's stories without needing formal introductions. Maya had been working at Morning Brew for almost 2 years now, ever since she'd moved to the city to attend community college law classes 3 evenings a week. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid enough to cover rent for her studio apartment 6 blocks away, and Ben Rodriguez, the owner, was understanding about her school schedule. Ben's family had run the cafe for 15 years, serving construction workers, office cleaners, and the occasional lost tourist who wandered off the main commercial strip. The regulars were Maya's favorite part of the job. She knew their orders by heart, remembered their kids' names, and had become a small but important part of their daily rhythm. Walter appeared at exactly 6:15 a.m., just as he had every weekday morning for the past 8 months. He was somewhere in his mid-60s, with silver hair that needed cutting and clothes that were clean but clearly not expensive. A navy windbreaker that had seen several seasons, dark jeans with faded knees, and work boots that suggested a man who wasn't afraid of getting his hands dirty. His order never varied. Black coffee, no sugar, and a slice of toasted wheat bread with butter. He always sat at the corner table near the window, spreading out his copy of an old Wall Street journal that he seemed to read with remarkable focus for someone who looked like he'd never set foot in a boardroom. The thing that had caught Maya's attention from the beginning was Walter's tip. Every morning, without fail, he left exactly $5 for a $4.50 order, sliding the bill under his saucer with the same quiet precision he brought to everything else. When Maya had mentioned it to Ben, the cafe owner had shrugged and said some people were just generous by nature, but Maya sensed there was more to it. Walter carried himself with a kind of dignity that seemed too refined for someone living on what appeared to be a very modest budget. And sometimes she caught him listening to conversations at other tables with the intense focus of someone accustomed to processing complex information quickly. Their conversations were brief but surprisingly meaningful. Walter always asked about her law classes, seemed genuinely interested in what she was studying, and occasionally offered insights about contracts or business law that were far more sophisticated than she would have expected from someone in his apparent circumstances. He spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had spent years choosing his words carefully, and there was something in his eyes, a watchfulness, maybe, or the look of someone who had learned to observe before acting. Maya had started to think of him as a puzzle she couldn't quite solve, a person whose surface story didn't quite match the details that emerged in their brief exchanges. This particular Tuesday morning started like any other, with Walter settling into his usual spot and unfolding his newspaper. Maya brought his coffee and toast without being asked, and they exchanged their customary small talk about the weather and her upcoming constitutional law exam. But something was different today. Walter seemed more restless than usual, checking his watch frequently and glancing toward the street with an expression that might have been concern or anticipation. When his phone rang at 6:45, he answered with unusual urgency, speaking in low tones that Maya couldn't quite overhear from behind the counter. The conversation was brief but clearly troubling. Walter stood up quickly, leaving his coffee half-finished and his newspaper folded on the table. In his haste to leave, he knocked his jacket from the chair back, and something small and metallic clattered to the floor. Maya watched him hurry toward the door without looking back, his usual composed demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like fear. After he disappeared around the corner, Maya walked over to clean his table and found a gold pocket watch lying beside the chair, its cover slightly dented but still gleaming under the cafe's harsh lights. Maya picked up the watch, feeling its substantial weight in her palm. The gold was real, she could tell, and the craftsmanship was clearly expensive, not the kind of thing someone in Walter's apparent financial situation would carry. When she opened the cover, expecting to find a simple clock face, her breath caught in her throat. Engraved in elegant script across the inside cover were the words, "William Hayes, for service above self," along with what appeared to be a corporate logo she didn't recognize. The watch itself was beautiful, clearly an antique, and represented more money than Maya made in several months at the café. The questions started forming immediately in Maya's mind. Why would Walter, someone who seemed to live simply, ate the same modest breakfast every morning, and left generous but not extravagant tips, be carrying a watch that was clearly worth thousands of dollars? And who was William Hayes? The engraving suggested this wasn't just any timepiece, but something given for achievement or recognition, the kind of gift a company might present to a longtime executive or valued employee. Maya turned the watch over in her hands, studying every detail, feeling like she was holding the first piece of a puzzle she hadn't known existed until this moment. That's when the black Mercedes sedans pulled up outside Morning Brew, and Maya's ordinary Tuesday morning transformed into something that would change her understanding of Walter and herself forever. The rest of Tuesday passed in a blur of questions Maya couldn't answer and suspicions she couldn't shake. After the men in suits had questioned her about William Hayes and driven away empty-handed, Maya had spent her shift studying every customer who entered the cafe, wondering if any of them were also not quite who they appeared to be. The pocket watch felt heavy in her apron pocket, its presence a constant reminder that Walter, whoever he really was, had secrets that apparently drew the attention of people who drove expensive cars and asked pointed questions. By closing time, Maya had made a decision that surprised her with its boldness. She was going to find out the truth. Her studio apartment that evening became an impromptu research center. Maya's laptop, usually reserved for law school assignments and job applications, became her window into a world she hadn't known existed. Searching for William Hayes produced hundreds of results, but when she added terms like CEO and corporate executive, the pieces began falling into place with startling clarity. Article after article from financial news sites told the story of William Hayes, former chief executive officer of Hayes Corporation, a mid-sized investment and development company specializing in urban renewal projects and commercial real estate. The photographs accompanying these articles showed a man in expensive suits standing behind podiums or sitting in boardrooms, but the face was unmistakably Walter's, perhaps 10 pounds heavier and certainly better dressed, but definitely the same person who had been quietly drinking black coffee in her cafe for 8 months. The timeline of William Hayes's downfall was both recent and dramatic. 3 months earlier, according to multiple news sources, the board of directors at Hayes Corporation had voted to remove him as CEO, following allegations of financial misconduct and misappropriation of company funds. The accusations, brought forward by Chief Financial Officer Thomas Crawford and supported by several board members, painted a picture of a once respected executive who had gradually lost touch with ethical boundaries. Hayes Corporation's stock price had plummeted following the announcement, and several major development projects had been put on hold pending investigation. William Hayes himself had seemingly vanished from public view entirely, with no statements to the press and no apparent legal representation fighting the charges. Maya read article after article, trying to reconcile the man described in these business publications with the Walter she had come to know. The William Hayes in the photographs looked confident, even commanding, surrounded by the trappings of corporate success. But she also noticed something in his expression, even in these formal portraits, that reminded her of the Walter she knew. A thoughtfulness, maybe, or a quality of listening that seemed different from the typical executive bluster she associated with powerful business leaders. The more she read, the more convinced she became that there were layers to this story that the business press hadn't uncovered. Details that might explain why a former CEO was now living anonymously in her neighborhood and frequenting a café that catered to working-class customers. At 8 o'clock that evening, as Maya was closing her laptop and trying to decide what to do with her newfound knowledge, Walter appeared at the café's front door. Ben had already left for the day, and Maya was alone, which suddenly seemed either very fortunate or potentially dangerous. She wasn't sure which. Walter knocked gently on the glass, and when Maya looked up from behind the counter, she could see the anxiety in his posture, the way he kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting to be followed. Against her better judgment, but driven by curiosity that had been building all day, Maya unlocked the door and let him in. "I believe I may have left something here this morning," Walter said, his voice carrying the same quiet dignity Maya remembered, but with an underlying tension she'd never heard before. His eyes went immediately to her apron pocket, where the outline of the pocket watch was probably visible, and Maya realized that this conversation was going to be unlike any they'd had during their months of pleasant morning exchanges. She pulled the watch from her pocket and held it out to him, watching his face carefully as she spoke. "You mean this, William?" The use of his real name hit Walter like a physical blow. Maya watched his shoulders sag slightly, and for a moment, the careful composure he'd maintained for 8 months seemed to crack entirely. He took the watch from her hands with fingers that trembled slightly, turning it over as if checking to make sure it was undamaged, before looking up at Maya with an expression that mixed relief, resignation, and something that might have been gratitude. "You know then," he said, and it wasn't really a question. "I wondered how long I could keep this up, how long before someone figured out who I used to be. I just hoped I'd have more time to gather what I needed." Maya gestured toward one of the cafe tables, and they sat across from each other in the dim light filtering through the front windows. Walter, she found it hard to think of him as William, even now, began to tell her a story that was far more complex than anything she'd read in the business press. Yes, he was William Hayes, former CEO of Hayes Corporation, but the charges against him were fabricated, part of an elaborate scheme orchestrated by Thomas Crawford and a coalition of board members who wanted to take control of the company for their own purposes. Crawford had been systematically manipulating financial records, creating the appearance of impropriety where none existed, while simultaneously positioning himself and his allies to benefit from the company's assets once William was removed from power. The story Walter told painted a picture of corporate betrayal that went far beyond simple office politics. Crawford, according to William, had been planning this takeover for months, possibly years, identifying board members who could be bought or intimidated, and carefully constructing a narrative that would make William's removal seem not only justified but necessary for the company's survival. The financial irregularities that had been attributed to William were real, but they had been Crawford's doing, hidden in complex accounting structures that would take months of investigation to untangle. By the time William realized what was happening, Crawford had already moved to consolidate power, and William found himself not only out of a job but facing potential criminal charges that could destroy his reputation permanently. "But why haven't you fought back?" Maya asked, her law school training kicking in despite the surreal nature of the conversation. "Why are you hiding out in a cafe instead of hiring lawyers and defending yourself in court or in the media?" William's answer revealed both his strategic thinking and his fundamental decency. He had been fighting back, but quietly, carefully, gathering evidence that would not only clear his name, but expose the full extent of Crawford's manipulation. Going public too early, without ironclad proof, would only give Crawford time to cover his tracks more thoroughly. William needed documentation that Crawford couldn't deny or explain away, and that meant staying invisible while he collected the pieces of a puzzle that would ultimately destroy his successor. The most surprising part of William's story was why he had chosen Maya's neighborhood. and specifically Morning Brew, as his hiding place. He had studied Crawford carefully over the years, knew the man's arrogance and his tendency to underestimate people he considered beneath his social class. Crawford would never think to look for a former CEO in a working-class café, and even if he did, he would never imagine that someone like Maya, young, working as a waitress, attending night school, could pose any threat to his carefully constructed deception. But William had been watching Maya for months, had recognized in her a combination of intelligence, integrity, and determination that reminded him of why he had gone into business in the first place: to build something meaningful that served people rather than simply generating profit for shareholders. "I know this sounds insane," William said, his hands wrapped around the pocket watch as if it were an anchor to his former life. "But I think I need your help. Crawford has resources I can't match: money, connections, legal teams. But he also has blind spots, and his biggest blind spot is that he can't imagine ordinary people being extraordinary when it matters. You're studying law. You understand how evidence works, and most importantly, you're invisible to him. You could go places and ask questions that would immediately raise suspicions if I tried to do them myself." Maya sat in the quiet cafe, surrounded by the familiar smells of coffee and pastry, trying to process the enormity of what William, was asking. 8 hours ago, she had been a part-time waitress whose biggest concern was passing her constitutional law exam. Now she was being recruited into what sounded like a complex corporate conspiracy that could determine not only William's future, but the fate of an entire company and all the people who depended on it for their livelihoods. The rational part of her mind screamed that this was way beyond anything she was equipped to handle. But another part of her, the part that had been drawn to law school in the first place, recognized an opportunity to do something that mattered, to use her growing legal knowledge for something more significant than term papers and hypothetical case studies. Looking into William's eyes, Maya made a decision that would change both their lives in ways neither could have anticipated. The Hayes Corporation building rose 23 stories into the downtown skyline, its glass and steel facade reflecting the city lights as Maya approached on Wednesday evening. William had spent Tuesday afternoon coaching her through the building's layout, security procedures, and the specific offices she would need to access. But standing on the sidewalk looking up at the corporate headquarters, Maya felt the full weight of what they were attempting. She was about to infiltrate a major corporation using nothing more than a borrowed cleaning company uniform and William's inside knowledge of security routines that might have changed dramatically since his departure 3 months earlier. The pocket watch in her bag felt like both a talisman and a reminder of what was at stake. William had arranged their entry through a contact who still worked in the building, someone from the night maintenance crew who remembered when William had treated cleaning staff with the same respect he showed to vice presidents and board members. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Maya would enter as a temporary worker for the cleaning company, giving her access to executive offices after business hours when security was lighter and the building was mostly empty. William would remain outside, monitoring communications and ready to create a distraction if Maya encountered unexpected problems. They had rehearsed the route through the building multiple times, but Maya knew that all their preparation couldn't account for the human element. The possibility of running into someone who might ask questions she couldn't answer. The 20th floor, where Crawford's office was located, felt different from the rest of the building. Even in the subdued lighting of after-hours cleaning mode, Maya could sense the atmosphere of power and money that permeated this level of Hayes Corporation. The carpets were thicker, the artwork more expensive, and the offices larger with better views of the city below. Maya moved through the hallways with her cleaning cart, playing her role while simultaneously observing everything around her. William had taught her to look for details that might seem insignificant, but could reveal patterns of behavior or decision-making. Who had access to certain areas, which offices showed signs of unusual activity, and what kinds of documents might be left visible on desks or in conference rooms. Crawford's corner office was a monument to corporate success, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the downtown district and furnishings that probably cost more than Maya made in a year. But it was the details that caught her attention: the multiple computer monitors, the locked file cabinets that seemed newer than other furniture in the office, and a conference table covered with documents that had been hastily stacked rather than properly filed. Maya photographed everything she could with her phone, being careful to capture not just individual documents, but their context and arrangement, the way William had taught her. Evidence, he had explained, wasn't just about what was written on paper, but about patterns and relationships that might not be obvious until you could study them carefully. The breakthrough came in Crawford's desk drawer, which had been left unlocked in violation of standard corporate security procedures. Inside, Maya found a folder labeled Project Sunset, containing emails, financial projections, and what appeared to be preliminary contracts with several companies she didn't recognize. The documents were dense with financial jargon and legal terminology, but even with her limited business background, Maya could see that they outlined a systematic plan to divest Hayes Corporation of its most valuable assets. Properties that the company had spent years developing were being sold at prices that seemed far below market value to entities with names that sounded more like shell companies than legitimate buyers. One email exchange in particular caught Maya's attention. In it, Crawford was discussing timeline concerns with someone identified only as JM, presumably James Morrison, one of the board members William had mentioned as being part of the conspiracy. The tone of the conversation suggested urgency and secrecy, with references to accelerating the transition and minimizing external scrutiny that made Maya's pulse quicken as she photographed each page. These weren't the communications of executives engaged in normal business operations. They read like the planning documents of people who knew they were doing something that wouldn't withstand public examination. The most damaging evidence was hidden in a separate folder tucked behind the Project Sunset materials. It contained account statements from what appeared to be offshore financial institutions, showing large deposits that corresponded roughly with the dates and amounts mentioned in the asset sale documents. Maya wasn't sophisticated enough in financial analysis to understand all the implications, but she could see enough to realize that Crawford wasn't just reorganizing the company for legitimate business reasons. He was systematically looting it, moving valuable assets to companies he apparently controlled while enriching himself through a complex web of financial transactions designed to hide the money trail. As Maya worked her way through Crawford's files, she became aware of sounds from the hallway that weren't part of the normal building maintenance routine. Footsteps that seemed to pause outside Crawford's office, the faint sound of voices conferring in whispers, and the distinctive electronic beep of someone using a security card to access a restricted area. Maya's training with William kicked in immediately. She pocketed the most important documents she had found, returned the office to its original appearance, and moved to the window where she could observe the hallway while pretending to clean the glass. What she saw made her heart race with a combination of fear and excitement. Two men in expensive suits were moving through the executive floor, checking offices and conference rooms with the systematic efficiency of people conducting a search. They weren't building security. Maya had been briefed on what the regular guards looked like, and they certainly weren't cleaning crew. These were Crawford's people, probably private investigators or security contractors, and their presence meant that Crawford suspected something was wrong. Maya watched them work their way down the hallway toward Crawford's office, knowing she had perhaps 30 seconds to complete her work and get out before they reached her location. The pocket watch in her bag seemed to grow heavier as she realized that their investigation had already attracted attention from people who had resources to conduct surveillance and searches that went far beyond normal corporate security measures. Maya's escape from the Hayes Corporation building that night was a masterclass in controlled panic. She managed to exit Crawford's office and blend back into her cleaning routine just as the two men rounded the corner, but she could feel their attention on her as she moved through the hallway with her cart. Every instinct told her to run, but William's training kept her moving at the steady pace of someone who belonged in the building and had legitimate work to do. It wasn't until she reached the service elevator and began her descent to the parking garage that Maya allowed herself to acknowledge how close she had come to being caught, and how much more dangerous their investigation had become now that Crawford clearly suspected he was being watched. The documents and photographs Maya had gathered that night would prove to be the foundation of everything that followed. But as she walked through the darkened streets toward her apartment, Maya realized that she and William had crossed a line from passive observation to active investigation. Crawford knew something was wrong, and that meant their window of opportunity was narrowing. Whatever they were going to do with the evidence they had gathered, they were going to have to do it quickly before Crawford had time to cover his tracks more thoroughly or take more aggressive steps to protect his conspiracy from exposure. Thursday morning at Morning Brew felt surreal after Maya's nighttime infiltration of Hayes Corporation. She served coffee to construction workers and office clerks while her mind processed financial documents and offshore account numbers, trying to reconcile her ordinary life with the extraordinary circumstances she had stumbled into. William arrived at his usual time, but instead of sitting at his regular table, he followed Maya into the cafe's small office behind the counter where they could speak privately. The documents Maya had photographed the night before were spread across Ben's desk, and in the harsh fluorescent light of the office, the scope of Crawford's scheme became even clearer and more disturbing. Maya's law school training in contracts and business organization proved invaluable as she and William began mapping the connections between the shell companies mentioned in the Project Sunset documents. Each entity had been carefully structured to obscure ownership while facilitating the transfer of assets from Hayes Corporation to private accounts that eventually traced back to Crawford and his co-conspirators. The financial engineering was sophisticated but not perfect. There were patterns in the timing of transactions, similarities in corporate structures, and most importantly, a paper trail that could be followed by someone with enough patience and knowledge of business law to understand what they were witnessing. William's expertise in corporate finance allowed him to explain what Maya was seeing in terms that transformed abstract numbers into a concrete story of betrayal and theft. Crawford hadn't just orchestrated William's removal from power. He had spent months systematically positioning himself to benefit from that removal. Properties that Hayes Corporation had developed over years of careful investment were being sold to Crawford's shell companies at artificially depressed prices, then immediately flipped to legitimate buyers at market value. The difference, millions of dollars in some cases, was being funneled through offshore accounts that would be virtually impossible for regulators to trace without specific knowledge of the transactions. The breakthrough in their investigation came when William suggested reaching out to Sarah Kim, a former Hayes Corporation accountant who had resigned suddenly just 2 weeks before William's removal as CEO. Sarah had been with the company for 8 years, had worked closely with both William and Crawford, and had access to financial records that would normally be protected by multiple levels of security and confidentiality agreements. William remembered that Sarah had seemed increasingly uncomfortable in meetings during her final months with the company, asking pointed questions about accounting procedures and expressing concerns about regulatory compliance that had apparently fallen on deaf ears. Sarah agreed to meet them at a coffee shop across town, far from Hayes Corporation and the downtown business district where she might be recognized by former colleagues. She was a woman in her early 40s with the careful demeanor of someone who had learned to be precise in a profession where small errors could have enormous consequences. When William explained what they had discovered about Crawford's activities, Sarah's reaction was immediate and powerful. Not surprise, but relief that someone else had finally begun to uncover what she had been witnessing for months before her resignation. Sarah had kept copies of financial documents that showed the early stages of Crawford's scheme, records that demonstrated how he had gradually gained access to accounts and approval processes that should have required William's direct oversight. The evidence Sarah provided transformed Maya and William's investigation from educated speculation into documented proof of criminal activity. Crawford had been manipulating Hayes Corporation's financial systems for almost a year before William's removal, gradually redirecting funds and assets through increasingly complex transactions designed to hide their ultimate destination. Sarah's records showed how Crawford had used his position as chief financial officer to approve expenditures and asset transfers that served no legitimate business purpose, instead enriching the shell companies that he controlled through intermediaries and offshore entities. Most damaging of all, Sarah had kept copies of emails in which Crawford explicitly discussed his plans to remove William and take control of the company's most valuable assets. As they worked through the financial documents that afternoon, Maya began to understand how Crawford's scheme extended far beyond simple corporate theft. Hayes Corporation had been involved in several urban development projects that served low-income communities, providing affordable housing and commercial space in neighborhoods that had been underserved by traditional real estate investment. Crawford's asset stripping was effectively killing these projects, leaving communities without the resources they had been promised and enriching a small group of conspirators at the expense of people who had trusted Hayes Corporation to deliver on its commitments. The human cost of Crawford's greed was becoming as clear as the financial damage, and Maya felt her determination to see justice done intensify with each new piece of evidence they uncovered. The most crucial discovery came when Sarah showed them how to access Hayes Corporation's offshore banking records through a secure portal that Crawford apparently didn't realize she still had access to. The accounts contained not just the proceeds from asset sales, but detailed transaction histories that revealed the full scope of the conspiracy. Crawford had been moving money through a network of accounts in 3 different countries, using sophisticated financial instruments to hide the source and destination of funds while ensuring that he and his co-conspirators could access their ill-gotten gains without triggering regulatory scrutiny. The total amount involved was staggering. Nearly $50 million in company assets had been diverted through Crawford's scheme, money that should have been used for legitimate business purposes or returned to shareholders as dividends. Maya spent Thursday evening in her apartment, surrounded by printouts and documents that told a story of corporate corruption on a scale she had never imagined possible. Her law school textbooks, which had always seemed theoretical and abstract, suddenly felt relevant and urgent as she recognized real-world applications of concepts like fiduciary duty, securities fraud, and corporate governance. The evidence they had gathered was compelling. But Maya knew from her studies that having proof of wrongdoing and being able to use that proof to obtain justice were 2 very different things. Crawford had resources, connections, and legal protection that would make any challenge to his authority difficult and dangerous. But Maya also knew that Crawford had made critical mistakes, the kind of errors that came from arrogance and the assumption that no one would be smart enough or determined enough to follow the complex trail he had created. The documents Sarah had provided showed that Crawford had violated not just corporate policies, but federal securities laws, regulations that carried serious criminal penalties and were enforced by agencies with the resources to conduct thorough investigations. What they needed now was a way to get this evidence to the right people: regulators, prosecutors, or journalists who could bring the full weight of the legal system to bear on Crawford and his conspiracy. Maya fell asleep that night, surrounded by evidence of corporate crime, knowing that tomorrow would bring decisions that could determine not just William's future, but the fate of everyone who had been harmed by Crawford's greed and ambition. The pocket watch sat on Maya's nightstand as she drifted off to sleep, its gold surface catching the last light from her reading lamp. For service above self. The engraving had taken on new meaning as Maya began to understand what William had been fighting for all along, and what she was now fighting for as well. Friday morning arrived with an early autumn chill that seemed to match the gravity of what Maya and William were preparing to do. They had decided that confronting Crawford directly was their best option, not because they expected him to confess and make restitution, but because they needed to gauge his reaction and potentially gather additional evidence through his responses to their accusations. William had spent the previous evening coaching Maya on the legal implications of recording conversations without consent, the admissibility of various types of evidence, and the importance of maintaining their safety while still pushing hard enough to get useful information. Maya had never imagined that her part-time job serving coffee would lead to her participating in what amounted to a corporate espionage operation. But the evidence they had gathered was too important to handle with anything less than professional seriousness. The confrontation would take place in the parking garage beneath Hayes Corporation, a location William had chosen because it offered privacy, multiple exit routes, and acoustic properties that would make their conversation difficult to overhear or electronically monitor. Maya would be positioned in a location where she could record the conversation on her phone while remaining hidden from Crawford's view, a plan that required precise timing and nerves that Maya wasn't entirely sure she possessed. William had made it clear that this meeting represented a significant escalation in their investigation. After Friday, Crawford would know for certain that someone was actively working to expose his scheme, and he would respond accordingly. Crawford arrived at the parking garage exactly on time, driving a silver BMW that probably cost more than Maya made in 3 years. He was a man in his early 50s, well-dressed, but with the soft appearance of someone who had spent more time in conference rooms than on construction sites or factory floors. Maya watched from her hiding place behind a concrete pillar as William approached Crawford's car, noting the way Crawford's body language immediately shifted from casual confidence to wary attention when he recognized his former colleague. Even from a distance, Maya could see that Crawford had not expected this meeting to be particularly challenging. His posture suggested someone preparing to deal with a nuisance rather than a serious threat. William's opening was direct and devastating. "I know about Project Sunset, Thomas. I know about the shell companies, the offshore accounts, and the asset transfers. I know exactly how you've been stealing from the company and how you manipulated the board to get rid of me." Crawford's reaction was immediate and telling, not the confusion or outrage of an innocent man falsely accused, but the calculating assessment of someone trying to determine how much his opponent actually knew and what options remained for damage control. Maya adjusted her position to get a better angle with her phone's camera, making sure she captured not just the conversation but Crawford's facial expressions and body language that would support their case. Crawford's initial response was predictably defensive, a mixture of denial and counterattack that focused more on William's credibility than on the substance of the accusations. "You're a disgraced former executive with a grudge, William. No one is going to believe conspiracy theories from someone who was removed for cause by his own board of directors." But as William began presenting specific details, account numbers, transaction dates, and the names of shell companies that Crawford thought were secret, Crawford's demeanor shifted dramatically. Maya watched him realize that this wasn't a fishing expedition or desperate speculation, but a confrontation backed by detailed knowledge of his activities that should have been impossible for William to obtain. The crucial moment came when William mentioned the Cayman Islands account that Sarah had discovered in the offshore banking records. Crawford's face went pale, and for the first time in the conversation, he seemed genuinely rattled. "How did you—" he began, then stopped himself, apparently realizing that admitting knowledge of the account would be tantamount to confessing to the entire scheme. But the damage was already done. His reaction had confirmed not only that the account existed, but that it was significant enough to shake his confidence when mentioned. Maya made sure to capture his expression at that moment, knowing that Crawford's involuntary response would be powerful evidence of his guilt, even if he refused to make any explicit admissions. William pressed his advantage, outlining exactly what would happen if Crawford didn't immediately begin making restitution and cooperating with authorities. The evidence would be turned over to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Department of Justice, and financial journalists who specialized in corporate fraud cases. Hayes Corporation's shareholders would be informed about the theft of their assets, and the communities that had been promised affordable housing and commercial development would learn that their projects had been canceled to enrich Crawford and his conspirators. Most importantly, William made it clear that he had multiple copies of all evidence in secure locations, so any attempt to intimidate or silence him would be futile and would only add additional criminal charges to Crawford's already substantial legal exposure. Crawford's response revealed both his arrogance and his fundamental misunderstanding of the situation he faced. Rather than showing any remorse or attempting to negotiate a resolution, he doubled down on threats and intimidation. "You have no idea who you're dealing with, William. I have resources and connections that you can't imagine. Whatever little game you think you're playing, I can end it with a phone call. And as for your waitress friend..." Crawford looked directly toward Maya's hiding place, making it clear that he knew she was there and had probably known about her involvement all along. There are consequences for people who get involved in situations they don't understand. Maybe she should think about whether serving coffee is worth risking everything she's worked for. The threat against Maya transformed the confrontation from a business dispute into something much more personal and dangerous. William's anger was controlled but unmistakable as he stepped closer to Crawford, his voice dropping to a tone that Maya had never heard from him before. "If you or anyone working for you approaches Maya, harasses her, or interferes with her life in any way, I will make sure that everything we've discovered about your activities becomes front-page news in every financial publication in the country. The evidence we have is already devastating, but I've been holding back some of the most damaging material because I thought you might be reasonable. Threaten her again, and you'll discover just how much more there is to find." Crawford's final words as he prepared to leave the parking garage revealed his complete lack of understanding about the forces he had set in motion. "This isn't over, William. You think you're fighting for justice or righteousness or some other naive ideal. But this is business. Money talks, and everything else is just sentiment. I'll destroy you in court, in the media, and in any other arena you want to choose. And when this is finished, you'll wish you had just accepted your termination," and disappeared quietly. As Crawford drove away, Maya emerged from her hiding place with her phone still recording, feeling shaken but also exhilarated by what they had accomplished. They now had Crawford's implicit admission of guilt, his threats against both of them on record, and most importantly, confirmation that their evidence was accurate enough to genuinely threaten his position. Walking back toward the street level, William and Maya both understood that their investigation had entered a new phase. Crawford would no longer be content to rely on his assumption that they posed no serious threat. He would take active steps to discredit them, intimidate them, or worse. But they also had momentum now, and evidence that would be difficult for Crawford to explain away once it reached the right authorities. The pocket watch in Maya's bag felt heavier as she realized that William's inscription about service above self was about to be tested in ways that neither of them could have anticipated when this all began with a forgotten timepiece on a café table. The weekend brought an escalation that neither Maya nor William had fully anticipated. Saturday morning, as Maya walked to her shift at Morning Brew, she noticed a black sedan parked across the street from her apartment building. The same car that had been there when she left for her evening law class on Friday, and again when she returned home that night. The surveillance was obvious enough that Maya realized it was intended to be noticed, a psychological tactic designed to make her feel vulnerable and watched. By Sunday, the intimidation had become more direct. A man in an expensive suit had visited the cafe during Maya's shift, ordered coffee he didn't drink, and spent 45 minutes asking other customers casual questions about Maya's habits, her school schedule, and her relationship with regular customers like Walter. Maya called William from the cafe's office, keeping her voice low as she described the escalating harassment. William's response was immediate and decisive. They could no longer afford to gather evidence slowly or build their case methodically. Crawford was moving to neutralize them as threats, which meant their window of opportunity to go public with their discoveries was rapidly closing. If they waited much longer, Crawford would have time to destroy additional evidence, buy off potential witnesses, or manufacture some crisis that would discredit their accusations before anyone had a chance to evaluate the merits of their case. The time for caution had passed. Now they needed to act with the kind of boldness that Crawford wouldn't expect from a former CEO and a part-time waitress. William's plan was elegantly simple. They would take their story directly to Jennifer Walsh, an investigative journalist at Financial Tribune, who had built a reputation for exposing corporate fraud and regulatory failures. Jennifer had won awards for her coverage of financial crimes, had sources throughout the Securities and Exchange Commission and Department of Justice, and most importantly, had a track record of protecting whistleblowers who provided information about corporate wrongdoing. William had researched her background thoroughly and believed she would be both competent to understand the technical aspects of Crawford's scheme and fearless enough to publish their findings despite whatever pressure Crawford might bring to bear. The meeting with Jennifer took place Sunday evening at a restaurant far from the downtown business district, in a neighborhood where none of them were likely to be recognized by Hayes Corporation employees or Crawford's surveillance team. Jennifer was a woman in her 40s with the focused intensity of someone accustomed to asking difficult questions and demanding detailed answers. She listened to William's story with the professional skepticism of an experienced journalist. But Maya could see her interest sharpen as they began presenting the documents, financial records, and recordings they had gathered. When they showed her the offshore banking records that Sarah had provided, Jennifer's demeanor shifted from polite attention to active engagement. And Maya realized they had found exactly the ally they needed. Jennifer's questions were precise and challenging. designed to test not just the accuracy of their evidence, but their credibility as sources. She wanted to understand William's motivations for pursuing Crawford rather than simply accepting his termination and moving on with his life. She probed Maya's background, trying to determine whether a part-time waitress and night school law student was really capable of understanding the complex financial transactions at the heart of their case. Most importantly, she wanted independent confirmation of their key claims, sources beyond William and Maya who could verify that Crawford's scheme was real, and that the evidence they had gathered was authentic rather than fabricated or misinterpreted. The breakthrough came when Jennifer contacted Sarah Kim directly, using secure communication methods that protected Sarah's identity while allowing Jennifer to verify the authenticity of the financial records they had provided. Sarah not only confirmed the accuracy of their evidence, but provided additional details that Maya and William hadn't discovered in their own investigation. Crawford's manipulation of Hayes Corporation's finances had begun even earlier than they had realized, and the total amount stolen was closer to $75 million rather than the $50 million they had initially estimated. More importantly, Sarah had been keeping detailed records of her interactions with Crawford precisely because she had suspected that she might someday need to protect herself from retaliation for her knowledge of his activities. Jennifer's article was published online Monday morning and appeared in the print edition of Financial Tribune Tuesday, with the kind of prominent placement that indicated the newspaper's confidence in both the story's accuracy and its significance. The headline, "Former CEO Alleges Massive Fraud in Own Termination," was accompanied by a detailed analysis of Crawford's financial manipulations, supporting documents that readers could examine themselves, an expert commentary from securities law professors and former regulators who explained the broader implications of the case for corporate governance and investor protection. Maya read the article 3 times in the café that morning, still hardly believing that her name appeared in a major financial publication alongside quotations from her interviews with Jennifer. The reaction was swift and dramatic. Hayes Corporation stock price fell 12% in the first hour of trading as investors absorbed the implications of the fraud allegations and began calculating the potential cost of legal settlements, regulatory fines, and criminal prosecution. The Securities and Exchange Commission announced that it was opening a formal investigation into Crawford's activities, and the Department of Justice indicated that it was reviewing the case for potential criminal charges. Most importantly, from William's perspective, several major institutional investors who held large positions in Hayes Corporation stock began calling for Crawford's immediate resignation and a complete audit of the company's financial practices under his leadership. Crawford's response confirmed everything that Maya and William had suspected about his character and his methods. Rather than addressing the substance of the allegations against him, he launched a coordinated attack on their credibility designed to shift public attention away from the evidence they had presented. William was portrayed as a disgraced executive seeking revenge against former colleagues, while Maya was dismissed as an unqualified amateur who had been manipulated into supporting false accusations she couldn't possibly understand. Crawford's allies in the business media published articles questioning Jennifer Walsh's journalistic standards and suggesting that Financial Tribune had been irresponsible in publishing unverified allegations from unreliable sources. But the strategy backfired spectacularly. The more Crawford and his supporters attacked William and Maya personally, the more attention they drew to the specific evidence that supported their case. Financial experts who examined the documents began confirming the patterns of suspicious transactions that Maya had first identified in Crawford's office. Former Hayes Corporation employees started coming forward with their own stories of questionable practices they had witnessed during Crawford's tenure as CFO. Most damaging of all, the recording Maya had made during the parking garage confrontation was analyzed by audio experts who confirmed its authenticity, providing indisputable evidence that Crawford had knowledge of activities that he was now claiming never happened. By Wednesday morning, Crawford's position had become untenable. The Hayes Corporation Board of Directors, faced with overwhelming evidence of fraud and mounting pressure from investors, regulatory agencies, and law enforcement, announced that Crawford had been suspended pending the outcome of official investigations. William received a phone call that afternoon from the chairman of the board, formally inviting him to return as interim CEO while the company worked to repair the damage that Crawford's scheme had caused to its finances, its reputation, and its relationships with the communities it served. Maya watched the news coverage from behind the counter at Morning Brew, feeling a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and pride that she had played a role in exposing corruption that could have continued for years if Crawford had succeeded in intimidating them into silence. The pocket watch that had started their entire investigation now sat on the counter beside the cash register, catching the light from the cafe's windows as Maya served coffee to customers who had begun recognizing her from newspaper photographs and television interviews. The inscription, "For service above self," had proven prophetic in ways that William could never have anticipated when he first received the watch years earlier. Maya was beginning to understand that sometimes the most important battles were fought not in courtrooms or boardrooms, but in the small decisions that ordinary people made when faced with opportunities to choose between safety and justice, between minding their own business and standing up for what was right. The Securities and Exchange Commission's investigation moved with a speed and thoroughness that surprised even Jennifer Walsh, who had covered dozens of corporate fraud cases throughout her career. Within 2 weeks of her article's publication, federal investigators had obtained court orders freezing Crawford's offshore accounts, searched his home and personal offices, and arrested him on charges that included securities fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit theft. The evidence that Maya and William had gathered proved to be just the beginning. Once investigators began following the financial trails that Sarah Kim had preserved, they uncovered additional layers of corruption that extended far beyond Hayes Corporation and implicated several other executives in what prosecutors described as a systematic scheme to loot corporate assets for personal enrichment. Maya found herself testifying before SEC investigators, congressional committee staff, and ultimately a federal grand jury that indicted Crawford and 3 of his co-conspirators on more than 30 criminal charges. The experience was simultaneously terrifying and exhilarating. Testifying about corporate fraud required her to master complex financial concepts that went far beyond anything she had encountered in her law school classes. But it also gave her a first-hand understanding of how the legal system worked to protect investors and punish white-collar criminals. The lead prosecutor, a career Department of Justice attorney named Robert Chen, told Maya that her testimony had been crucial in helping jurors understand how Crawford's scheme had operated and why his actions constituted serious crimes rather than mere business disagreements. William's return to Hayes Corporation as interim CEO was marked by a transparency and accountability that stood in stark contrast to the secretive maneuvering that had characterized Crawford's leadership. His first action was to hire an independent forensic accounting firm to conduct a complete audit of the company's finances under Crawford's management, a process that ultimately recovered nearly $60 million of the $75 million that had been stolen through the various shell companies and offshore accounts. William also established an employee whistleblower program that encouraged workers to report suspicious activities without fear of retaliation, and he created an ethics committee with genuine authority to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action against executives who violated company policies or legal requirements. The human dimension of Crawford's crimes became clearer as William worked to restart the community development projects that Crawford had canceled to fund his asset-stripping scheme. Families who had been waiting for affordable housing discovered that their homes would be built after all, with Hayes Corporation committing to complete the projects even though they would generate smaller profits than Crawford's alternative investments. Small business owners who had lost commercial space when Crawford sold their buildings to his shell companies were offered new locations at below-market rents, funded by the money that investigators had recovered from Crawford's offshore accounts. Maya watched these developments from her position as Hayes Corporation's new corporate ethics officer, a role that William had created specifically for her and that came with a full scholarship to complete her law degree. Maya's transformation from part-time waitress to corporate executive was remarkable, but she insisted on maintaining her connection to Morning Brew by working weekend shifts at the café. Ben Rodriguez had initially protested that she was too important now for serving coffee, but Maya explained that her weekend work helped her remember why corporate ethics mattered in the first place. The customers at Morning Brew, construction workers, office cleaners, immigrant families struggling to build better lives, were the people who ultimately bore the cost when executives like Crawford prioritized personal enrichment over a responsible stewardship of corporate resources. Maya's law school education was giving her the technical knowledge she needed for her new role, but her shifts at the cafe provided the moral foundation that made that knowledge meaningful. The ripple effects of Crawford's prosecution extended far beyond Hayes Corporation and became a catalyst for broader reforms in corporate governance and financial regulation. Congressional hearings examined how Crawford had been able to manipulate board processes and accounting procedures without detection for so long, leading to new requirements for independent oversight of executive compensation and asset management. The Securities and Exchange Commission updated its guidelines for corporate whistleblower protection, making it easier for employees like Sarah Kim to report suspicious activities without risking their careers or financial security. Most importantly, several other companies began voluntary audits of their own financial practices, apparently concerned that they might have executives engaged in similar schemes that had simply not yet been discovered. Maya's testimony before Congress was broadcast live on financial television networks, and she used the opportunity to emphasize that corporate fraud was not a victimless crime, but a form of theft that ultimately harmed ordinary workers, investors, and communities. She spoke about the families whose housing had been delayed, the small businesses that had lost their locations, and the shareholders whose retirement funds had been depleted by Crawford's manipulation of stock prices and dividend payments. Maya's background as a waitress and night school student gave her credibility with audiences who might have dismissed similar testimony from traditional corporate executives, and her ability to explain complex financial concepts in accessible language made her an effective advocate for stronger regulatory enforcement and corporate accountability. The legal proceedings against Crawford culminated in a trial that lasted 3 months and generated extensive media coverage throughout the business and legal communities. Crawford's defense team argued that he had been acting within his authority as chief financial officer, and that any irregularities in Hayes Corporation's finances had been approved by William before his termination. But the evidence that Maya, William, and Sarah had gathered proved overwhelming. Financial records, email exchanges, offshore account statements, and the recording from the parking garage confrontation all supported the prosecution's case that Crawford had engaged in a deliberate scheme to steal corporate assets and manipulate board processes to cover his tracks. Crawford was ultimately convicted on 28 of 32 criminal charges and sentenced to 15 years in federal prison, with additional requirements to pay restitution to Hayes Corporation and the investors who had been harmed by his actions. The judge who imposed the sentence specifically noted that Crawford had shown no remorse for his crimes and had attempted to intimidate witnesses who were cooperating with the investigation, factors that justified a longer prison term than might otherwise have been appropriate for a first-time white-collar offender. Maya attended the sentencing hearing and watched Crawford's reaction as the judge described the impact of his crimes on the communities and individuals who had trusted Hayes Corporation to act with integrity and responsibility. The pocket watch that had initiated Maya's involvement in the case now sat in a place of honor on her desk at Hayes Corporation, serving as a daily reminder of the values that had motivated her investigation and the importance of maintaining those values even as her professional responsibilities expanded. William had presented the watch to Maya during a ceremony marking her promotion to ethics officer, telling the assembled employees and board members that she had earned the right to its inscription through her willingness to risk her safety and her future to expose corruption and protect the innocent. Maya accepted the watch with a speech that emphasized how ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when they had the courage to act on their convictions and the knowledge to act effectively. 6 months after Crawford's sentencing, Maya stood at the window of her corner office on the 20th floor of Hayes Corporation, looking down at the Morning Brew Café where her remarkable journey had begun. The view from her new position allowed her to see both the bustling downtown business district and the residential neighborhood where working families lived in apartments and small houses that Crawford's greed had once threatened to destroy. Maya had kept her promise to maintain her weekend shifts at the cafe, and those few hours each week serving coffee and talking with longtime customers provided perspective that no amount of corporate training could have given her about the real-world impact of business decisions and ethical choices. The pocket watch sat open on Maya's desk, its gold surface catching the morning sunlight as she reviewed reports from Hayes Corporation's community development projects. The affordable housing initiative that Crawford had attempted to cancel was now ahead of schedule and under budget, providing homes for 47 families who had been waiting years for safe, decent places to live. The Small Business Incubator program was supporting 12 new ventures owned by immigrants and first-generation Americans, offering commercial space and mentorship that would have been impossible under Crawford's profit maximization strategy. Most importantly, Hayes Corporation's stock price had recovered to levels higher than before the scandal, proving that ethical business practices and financial success were not incompatible goals. Maya's law school graduation ceremony took place on a sunny Saturday afternoon in late spring, with William and Ben Rodriguez sitting in the audience alongside Maya's parents, who had flown in from California to watch their daughter receive her degree. Maya's valedictorian speech focused on the relationship between legal knowledge and moral courage, drawing on her experiences with the Crawford investigation to argue that the law was most powerful when it was used to protect people who couldn't protect themselves, rather than simply to advance the interests of those who already possessed wealth and influence. The speech was picked up by legal publications and business schools, where it became required reading for courses on professional responsibility and corporate ethics. William's permanent return as CEO of Hayes Corporation was confirmed by a unanimous vote of the board of directors, but his leadership style bore little resemblance to the typical corporate executive model that Crawford had embodied. William held monthly meetings with employees at all levels of the organization, asking for feedback about company policies and suggestions for community initiatives that Hayes Corporation might support. He instituted profit-sharing programs that ensured all workers benefited when the company performed well, and he established advisory committees that included not just business leaders, but representatives from the neighborhoods where Hayes Corporation operated development projects. Maya served as William's liaison to these community groups, using her legal training and her background in the service industry to bridge gaps between corporate decision-making and grassroots concerns. The investigation and prosecution of Crawford had made Maya something of a celebrity in legal and business circles, but she used her platform to advocate for systemic changes rather than personal advancement. She spoke at law schools about the importance of corporate ethics, testified before regulatory agencies about the need for stronger whistleblower protections, and worked with community organizations to help ordinary citizens understand their rights when dealing with corporate misconduct. Maya's message was consistently that individual courage and collective action could hold powerful institutions accountable, but only if people were willing to take risks and make sacrifices when they encountered wrongdoing that affected others. The most satisfying aspect of Maya's new role was seeing how the principles that had motivated her initial investigation continued to guide Hayes Corporation's operations and culture. The company's ethics hotline received regular reports from employees who felt comfortable raising concerns about potential problems before they became serious violations. The community advisory committees provided early warning about projects that might not serve neighborhood interests, allowing Hayes Corporation to modify its plans rather than impose unwanted changes on residents who lacked political power to resist. Most importantly, the company's commitment to transparency and accountability had attracted investors who valued long-term sustainability over short-term profit maximization, providing financial stability that Crawford's aggressive tactics had actually undermined. Maya's weekend shifts at Morning Brew had evolved into something approaching legend among the cafe's regular customers, many of whom enjoyed the novelty of having their coffee served by someone who appeared regularly on business television and had testified before Congress about corporate fraud. But Maya treasured these interactions because they reminded her that her work at Hayes Corporation ultimately mattered only insofar as it made life better for people like the construction workers, office cleaners, and immigrant families who had always been her favorite customers. The conversations she had over coffee provided insights about the real-world impact of corporate policies that no boardroom presentation could have conveyed. Ben Rodriguez had initially worried that Maya's success would lead her to abandon the cafe entirely, but her continued presence had actually increased Morning Brew's reputation and business. The cafe had become a destination for business school students studying corporate ethics, law school clinics working on whistleblower protection cases, and journalists researching stories about white-collar crime and regulatory enforcement. Maya used these opportunities to emphasize that the most important legal and ethical principles were not abstract concepts, but practical tools for protecting communities and ensuring that economic power served human dignity rather than undermining it. The final scene of Maya's transformation played out on a quiet Tuesday morning in early autumn, exactly 1 year after Crawford's arrest. Maya arrived at Morning Brew before her shift at Hayes Corporation to have coffee with William, who still came by regularly despite his demanding schedule as CEO. They sat at the same corner table where William had spent months reading old copies of the Wall Street Journal while gathering evidence against Crawford. But now their conversation focused on future plans rather than past grievances. William was considering establishing a foundation that would provide legal assistance to employees who wanted to report corporate misconduct but lacked the resources to protect themselves from retaliation. Maya opened the pocket watch as they talked, running her finger over the inscription that had launched their investigation and changed both their lives. For service above self had proven to be more than just a corporate motto or inspirational slogan. It had become a practical philosophy that guided their decisions and defined their relationship to the power and responsibility that came with their positions at Hayes Corporation. Maya realized that the inscription described not just an ideal, but a choice that had to be made repeatedly, in small moments and large crises, by people who understood that their individual success was meaningful only when it contributed to something larger than personal advancement. As William prepared to leave for his first meeting of the day, he paused at the cafe door and looked back at Maya, who was preparing for her own transition from weekend waitress to weekday executive. "You know," he said, "I think we proved that sometimes the most important battles are fought by the most unlikely warriors, in the most ordinary places." Maya smiled and closed the pocket watch, slipping it into her bag next to the case files she would review during her commute to Hayes Corporation. She had learned that justice was not an abstract concept but a daily practice, requiring vigilance, courage, and the willingness to act when action was needed, regardless of the personal cost or the odds of success. The morning light streamed through the windows of Morning Brew as Maya finished her shift and prepared to begin another day of corporate ethics work. Carrying with her the knowledge that ordinary people could indeed change extraordinary circumstances when they combined moral courage with practical knowledge and refused to accept corruption as an inevitable part of business and politics. Sometimes, as she had discovered, kindness opens doors that power never could. And the most important victories are won not in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the small decisions that ordinary people make when they choose to serve something greater than themselves. The pocket watch now rests on Maya's desk at Hayes Corporation, its inscription serving as a daily reminder that true leadership means putting service above self-interest, and that the most powerful force for justice is often found in the quiet courage of ordinary people who refuse to look the other way when they witness wrongdoing. Sometimes, the smallest acts of integrity create the largest waves of change.